Welcome to Tuesday Home Time with Joan Bartlett, on air and online until 6 p.m. Listening on 8:55 a.m. on the analogue, 3CR digital, streaming or podcasting on 3cr.org.au. Lots of choices. Then to the situation in Sri Lanka today for the people of that country through the eyes of a former leader of a mass liberation movement in the 1970s and 80s, Lionel Bopajai. It's now 14 years since the brutal end of the war in Sri Lanka, and perhaps will never be known how many Tamils died in May 2009. Estimates range from 40,000 to 100,000 people. But has the ending of the war meant prosperity, as the government describes the present situation, with predictions that the economy will be back in the black by 2026. For an understanding of the true situation in Sri Lanka, I spoke with Lionel Bopajai, who was jailed twice and tortured for his role as a former leader of the mass liberation movement in the 1970s and 1980s. He now lives in political exile in Australia, where he and his family continue to be outspoken defenders of human rights and for social justice. Lionel, it's now 7 months since the anti-government protests began in the capital, Colombo. Looking back on the reasons for those protests.
There were a couple of reasons. The government of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, which came to power in 2019, they took several measures. One is to reduce taxes of the small tax base in Sri Lanka. Then they cut down on the fertilizer imports because the country had to pay. They didn't have foreign exchange reserves to pay. And the COVID crisis, as well as the Russia-Ukraine war, created a pretty bad situation, which was obviously exacerbated by what they were doing in Sri Lanka. Again, those problems were exacerbated by corruption, mismanagement, and also wastage. So there were systemic issues that were affecting the economic situation of Sri Lanka. Then there were international factors that were affecting the situation. The economic situation obviously became a major political crisis. People didn't have fuel, medication, cooking gas, electricity cutoffs, sort of only a few hours of the day they had electricity and so on. So people were encountering severe difficulties. And because of that situation, irrespective of politics, people came onto the streets, start protesting. That is how the protest came into being. It started in urban areas first, and then it gradually moved on to the other areas, and it became island-wide protest movements. In May 2022, it turned out, it led to a general strike, and from then on, the situation slightly changed because of the issues that arose within the protest movement itself, because until then, the protest movement was not led by a single political entity, or it was said political. And then also there was no leader, particular leader, not led by any leadership. There was a bit of anarchy as well. But then all these groups got together and probably had some sort of interactions with each other that led to a strong protest movement, like what happened in Middle East. That led to forcing out the previous president, the previous prime minister, and the finance minister of their regime to resign.
And who replaced them?
That is the issue. The Rajapaksas were able to appoint, I would like to emphasize, that the Rajapaksa clan led political bandwagon. They were able to appoint Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe as president. Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe was not elected as president by the people. In fact, he was defeated by the people at the last general elections. Whatever happened with the protests, previous Rajapaksa bandwagons, corrupt, inefficient and wasteful regime, it continues to mismanage Sri Lanka and its economy. I would like to address the current situation in the context of an address President Ranil Wickremesinghe made to Parliament this Wednesday. President spoke about the hardships ordinary people are faced with. However, he or his regime has not shown any tendency to any action to tighten the belts of those at the helm, whether they are of the political class, the super rich, or the bureaucracy. The tax rates imposed on the monthly income of professionals have made it difficult for them to survive. However, no plans have been made or outlined to make individuals and entities engaged in tax avoidance or money laundering to either pay their dues or bring their money back. Nevertheless, the president announced he would establish a presidential commission to investigate all political parties. So that's not a good sign. Obviously, this is to target his political opponents, particularly organizations and political parties supporting the just demands of the people. In addition, the president spoke about state intervention in the media industry, including social media or the World Wide Web, using a self-regulatory mechanism, he said. So the future doesn't look so good. It also appears currently the president is encouraging chauvinist groups to stir up chauvinism and communalism. He was talking about devolving power within a unitary state. I think he referred to the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. In the past, most of the regimes and chauvinists, they opposed implementation of the 13th Amendment. That was on the ground that the provincial councils in the north and east would use it for advancing the cause of separation. In the meanwhile, Buddhist monks burned down the 13th Amendment during the president's speech itself. The president's attempt appears to make use of this issue to strengthen his frail political position and to push through the IMF-imposed austerity measures. The ruling classes in Sri Lanka, regardless of their color, have used discrimination against the non-majoritarian communities to divide society along ethno-linguistic and religious lines. What the regime should be doing is abolishing the autocracy by repealing the executive presidency, repealing all repressive legislation, including the Prevention of Terrorism Act and the recently enacted Bureau of Rehabilitation Act, releasing of all political prisoners, fully restoring civilian ownership of land and property in the north and east. But they are not trying to do any of those.
Lionel, what happened to the just demands of the people in those demonstrations?
The major demand was "Gota go home," that was their slogan. But it was not limited to sending Gotabaya Rajapaksa home. It was more anti-systemic. They wanted the system change. And now the system change has not happened. What has happened is now the system has become more autocratic with the new president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, exercising more autocratic power that he has received under the executive presidency. The system continues. The demands of the protest movement, they are yet to be achieved. According to the surveys that have been done recently, there is strong support for the demands of the protest movement throughout the island, irrespective of people's background. But then the issue is, if the government is going to hold elections, then what sort of tactics they will use to divert the attention of the people away from the major issue. They are already planning to distribute 10 rations of rice and there are so many other things in the offing. So when these things happen, people tend to become more thinking in the short term and become more opportunistic, thinking individualistically. The situation can change unless there is a strong movement, a united, powerful, reliable, a movement that people could trust. If there is such a movement who could raise the awareness of the people about these issues without infighting among the forces of the opposition, then that would create a better ground for achieving what the people have been struggling for.
Are you saying that the demonstrations have stopped?
No, they are continuing. What has happened is there have been many since Ranil Wickremesinghe came into power. What he did is that he used exorbitant power, extraordinary power of the security forces to crush all the protests, arrest many people, not only the leaders, those who have been taking part in protests. They were going after them, and they were intimidating using the intelligence organizations. Some of them were kept in jail for a long while, like the leaders of the Inter-University Students' Federation. They were kept under Prevention of Terrorism Act for some time. Most of them were released on bail by the court. But what has happened is the regime is manipulating the police ordinance, which is vestige of colonialism, and associated legislation to hold the arrested protesters in custody for as long as possible. When President addressed the Parliament last Wednesday, he made it clear that his government is not there to be popular. It is there to implement unpopular decisions for the sake of the nation. He threatened protesters, workers, other opponents of his regime, austerity measures imposed by the IMF that his regime is implementing. And he stated that no one has the right to create anarchy. He said he would use full force to prevent it. While he was making this statement, there were tens of thousands of workers protesting against the regime's austerity measures. What happened is the president and his minister for security mobilized the military, the police, and other armed gangs to attack the protest. Under Ranil Wickremesinghe's regime, heavily armed military contingents are deployed at all protest sites, using hundreds of police with anti-riot squads and water cannons. Last week, for example, a peaceful march by the National People's Power, the JVP affiliated sort of an organization, it was attacked by these security contingents. One protester was killed, another is in hospital with serious injuries, and many others were injured. The day before yesterday, protest at the law faculty of the University of Colombo. It was organized by the Inter-University Students' Federation. It was attacked and led to the death of a security officer employed by the University of Colombo. What the Human Rights Commission has done under these circumstances, they have called the Minister for Public Security, Tira Nalles. The Human Rights Commission has summoned him to appear before the Commission in order to investigate this violent suppression or terror used by the police and security forces during those protests. I don't know what would happen because usually they don't appear even though there are summons. And the Human Rights Commission is an independent commission and they don't have any sort of power, punitive powers. The regime states, actually the president in his statement said that they accept the people's right to freedom of speech, assembly and protest. However, in the same speech, he praised the armed forces and the police while strengthening their repressive powers at the same time. President asked trade unions to consider the current economic situation. And actually, the regime has asked so. and not to disrupt any essential or critical services. They have been also asked to refrain from participating in any activities that could destabilize the economy. The regime has demonstrated in practice what it will do if they don't listen. They will unleash unprecedented violence and terror on peaceful sit-downs, protests, assemblies, and marches. So the situation appears to be worsening over time, with the regime hell-bent on suppressing freedoms for peaceful assembly, speech, protests, and marches.
And that was part one of an interview with Lionel Bopajade, who was a former leader of the mass liberation movement in Sri Lanka in the 1970s. And next week we'll continue on with Lionel's story.